they were getting in front of these beams, and what happened was that we found out later the propulsion systems in their ships were somewhat plutonium oriented, and when they would get in front of these beams, it would cause what's called a critical mass and a flash point inside their little ships. So when a nuclear reactor reaches critical mass, it puts a huge amount of heat out, and as a result, it kind of roasted the people inside of their ships. It was very uncomfortable. So the ships came down relatively intact because they were brought down by an internal problem caused by these testing of these radar sets. And of course, when the one crashed in Roswell, which is the one that set things off in our public society, it wasn't the first ship that fell on Matt Braswell's ranch. It was the second ship that they don't talk about. It was about 100 feet across that had a lot of human body parts that put the lid on the whole UFO thing back in then. You don't hear much about that. I really didn't know about it at that time either. I found out about it later on when I was working at Rockwell and NASA, because some of the people I worked with, their fathers had been out on the actual expedition at Roswell and had made the actual report. So I got direct family information on the authenticity of what these crashes were. And the Roswell wasn't the only one. There was one in Laredo. There was one in Aztec, New Mexico. They were in several different areas. So it wasn't just like this was the only one. So I spent a couple of years up at Point Arena and decided it was time to leave there. So I left the Air Force and came down to Southern California and went to work for Rockwell Corporation. And I'd been trained in instrumentation along with everything else in the Air Force, and I continued on with my training in instrumentation. And I also had a physics background by this time too, pretty strong physics. So I had an actually an electronic and physics and somewhat of a mechanical engineering background at this time, with some interesting studies and things that I had done. So my instrumentation made me very valuable, because at this point in my life I was able to instrument or put quantitative and qualitative analysis programs to work for any project you might have. And so you could be IBM, you could be Rockwell, you could be anybody. In the case, my first series of assignments was Rockwell, because it was like a miniature group of many, many corporations. You know, there was the Aeronautics Division, we had the Santa Susana Rocketdyne Division, we had all these things. We were developing guidance equipment. I worked on what was called a G-10 gyro, which went into a Minuteman rocket. I worked on other gyros and sevens that went into nuclear submarines. I remember the Thresher, when it went down, we had put the guidance system in that. I worked on the guidance systems that later on went into the Saturn. As a matter of fact, it was my work that got me down to Seal Beach and the NASA facilities because of that work that I did. I worked over at Autonetics on what was called the ILAS project. The ILAS project later on became, during Reagan's time, was known as Star Wars, where we were using neodymium and europium solid-state rare earth lasers, which back in now we're in the 60s, later 60s, people didn't even know what that stuff was in those days. The word laser, light amplification by stimulation emission of radiation, was unheard of in the general public. But yours truly was there with his sleeves rolled up, having a great old time. So I worked all over Rockwell, and I got to know all the different kinds of instrumentation. My job was not only repairing, calibrating some of the equipment. So I had what's called a meteorology background, and I took always taking more classes. I was always taking a NASA class for soldering or inspections, and learning how to do more and more, delicate kind of instrumentation projects. So I was constantly working and studying in those days, and that was where a kind of interesting thing happened. That's where I sort of got into nutrition. I was young, but I was having tremendous leg cramps and problems. This cramping and pain in my legs, and I was only like 21 years old. My leg pains were so great that I had to wear these support stockings. And I guess I had some kind of a circulation problem. I even had a little bit of a varicose vein problem. So somebody suggested, I used to stop work. We were working in these big hangars on cement floors. And I had to stop and go in, and they would apply heat lamp treatments to my legs on a daily basis, which the company didn't really like doing, and I didn't really like having it done, but it did relieve the pain, but it was stupid. So I ran into somebody, I forget who it was, I think it was a doctor at the time, and he says, why don't you try vitamin E? I says, okay, I'll try vitamin E. So I went down to the store. They didn't have health food stores, and then you just had to, I forget where I got the vitamin E. I found it somewhere. And I started taking it, and within about 3 weeks, I know that my cramping in the legs stopped. It actually went away. And that was really neat. I no longer had cramping of the legs, and that was my sojourn into nutrition, which of course it went far beyond that afterwards, but that was where it was at the time, and it was really great. It was probably during this time that I somehow or other was beginning to get some kind of a subconscious telepathic impulse from the Pleiadians, because I began to think a lot about spaceships while I was working at Rockwell, especially when I got down to Seal Beach. And Seal Beach it's on the California coast, and that's where we would take our part of the Saturn project and put it in a boat and ship it down to the Cape where it would be launched, and actually assembled and launched. And the two main areas that I worked on was the second stage of the Saturn rocket and the Apollo itself. I sat in every single Apollo module ever built. I actually sat in it and did some testing and things. I used to pretend I was an astronaut. I'd lay back in those seats and flip the switches on the ceiling. It was kind of neat. I guess a lot of people would like to do that, but I got to do it. So anyway, while we were down at Seal Beach, we had a lot of accidents happen because the programs did not go that smoothly. They actually went very, very badly. We had more problems than you might even know about. We used to have fires because things weren't wired right, so we put electricity to a circuit and it would burn up. And one time we were doing some pressure testing to simulate the fuel, and we were in one of the tanks, and the fuel tank broke, and about 500,000 gallons of water spilled all over the place and flooded the area. So, I mean, we had some interesting things happen. But I remember telling my cohorts at the time that we would have a flying saucer come and visit us the first time we took a Saturn out of the hangar. And the hangar was a big, tall building, looked like a skyscraper with the doors opening up on the side of it, and the entire side of the skyscraper opening up and the rocket coming out on a big track that was on. And that's exactly what happened. I forget what year it was, but it was probably around 65 or so. We opened the doors and brought the rocket out. The first time we'd had one out at night, because most of us worked at night. And sure enough, 420 people witnessed a flying saucer hovering in Seal Beach right over the top of one of these brand new Saturn rockets that we were building, second stage, which I thought was kind of interesting. So that created a pathway of excitement. So anyway, I left Rockwell and went on into my own private endeavors. I worked out in the private sector for a long time because I found that I had a lot of skills that people wanted. And so I began to go to thousands of companies all around the country selling them instruments, because I became first a manufacturer's rep, and then I had my own company where I actually remanufactured test equipment, sold new test equipment, and put together testing systems, entire testing systems for people around the country. And so I got to visit IBM in New York and Bell Telephone at Murray Hill, and all kinds of nice IBM and RCA plants down in Florida. And I used to go to the Atomic Energy Commission out in Amarillo, Texas, and sit on top of nuclear weapons underground and teach them how to monitor their weapons better, because all those warheads had to be kept alive and nursed. They had to be babysitted on a daily basis. So that kept me going for quite a number of years. It was interesting, too, because just before 9/11, I was working with Stephen Greer on the Disclosure Project. And we were trying to there's a lot of times the government almost released information of extraterrestrials to the public. The first time, I believe, was where it almost happened was in 92, when the Ringham and Barnum and Bailey circus people down in Florida were told that they could, from the Pentagon, receive a couple of fetuses, or extraterrestrial type fetus arrangements, in a solution in a jar, in a glass jar, that could be observed, and shown to the general public some samples of a crashed spaceship and some very interesting videos. And so they spent about $10 million getting together a circus train to go around the country to do all of this. I remember, I think it was November of 92, in the 11th hour, when the Barnum and Bailey was all ready to go to town and start bringing the American public the awareness of extraterrestrials interfacing with us. the Pentagon at the 11th hour pulled the plug, and Barnum and Bailey was out about $10 million, and they weren't very happy. That was the beginning of what I believe to be the attempt to bring about some kind of public knowledge of confirmation of what was really going on. So anyway, I was involved with Stephen Greer, and he's a Beltway brat from Washington, D.C., and we had some pretty good ends over at the Senate, so we were